Hello, everybody. Welcome to Openness and Practice, our presentation, our webinar on new visions of collaborative publishing from the Journal of Critical Digital Librarianship. My name is Sophie Ziegler. I'm the events coordinator here at Library Juice Press and Academy and Connections and all the wonderful things that Library Juice is up to, which I will say a little bit about for a few minutes before I pass it off to our panel. So Library Juice Connections is the events arm of both Library Juice Academy and Library Juice Press. We are a central place for all of our events, a space for new ways to connect, and a place for connection for all of us thinking about the role of libraries in today's world, all the ways that it's starting to look different, all the ways that we can be sure that we're connecting with the world in meaningful ways, and connecting with each other in ways that help keep us sane. Library Juice also is Library Juice Academy, which many of you may know. We are online professional development project. We do courses for librarians and archivists and other staff focusing on practical topics to build new skills. We do asynchronous learning, usually over a 4-week period. These are Moodle based. These are taught by experts in the field of all types. It's a wonderful way to continue our education, to catch up on all the things that we thought maybe we didn't need to know. And yeah, it's actually a lot of really, really interesting things. I encourage you to take a look at libraryjuiceacademy.com. And we also have Library Juice Press, in which we publish books and journals, including the Journal of Critical Digital Librarianship, where we examine theoretical and practical issues in librarianship from a critical perspective for an audience of professional librarians and students of library science. You can find more about all of this at litwinbooks.com, from which we are an imprint. Just very briefly, want to point out all the wonderful things that are coming up. We've got a lot of great events. On October 28th and November 3rd, we are doing book launches for Information Power and Reproductive Health. That's a 2-part book launch because we have so many wonderful authors associated with that. November 13th, we'll be having a webinar on human trafficking in libraries. And November 17th, another book launch from Library Juice Press on educating with empathy. And this is just in the next couple of weeks. We have a lot of really wonderful things for the rest of the calendar year, as well as events already being lined up for early next year. So please do take a look. And if you're curious about where you should take a look, we are on all of the social media platforms that we like to spend time on. You can find us on Facebook and Mastodon, LinkedIn, Instagram, Blue Sky. Find all of our recorded webinars and other events on our YouTube channel. That's at Library Juice Connections. And that is all I wanted to say. That's all I have. And I am so happy to step to one side and turn this over to Leah Duncan. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Sophie. I think that Kay is going to start sharing our screen. And in the meantime, I just want to say thank you to Library Juice for giving us the opportunity to share some of what we think is really special about the Journal of Critical Digital Librarianship. And thank you, participants, for joining us in this webinar, Openness in Practice. I see some familiar names in the participant list, so that's making me really happy. The next hour or so, less than an hour, we've got a reviewer, a JCDL writer, an audio producer. We're going to share some of our successes and challenges navigating open peer review with JCDL. I'm going to start with some JCDL basics. The Journal of Critical Digital Librarianship is an open access and open peer review journal that publishes and builds community around cultural heritage digital library work. We focus on work that integrates feminist, anti-racist, post-colonial, queer, anti-ableist, increasingly technocritical frameworks. And we are interested in critical approaches to topics along the lines of selection for digitization, metadata remediation, collections as data, teaching with digital collections, and so on. We are open to submissions from authors at any career stage, including folks without institutional affiliation. and we welcome contributions regarding projects, communities, technologies, regardless of their language, size, or funding. In the past, we've published articles, interviews, podcasts, Tumblr blogs, and other scholarly creative formats that are a little harder to define. And this is my pitch that we would be absolutely delighted to consider your work, whether that's original research, reviews of literature, digital collections, case studies, dialogues, reflections, accounts of failure. And we invite you to share your work in any format, whether traditional or less traditional, whatever best suits your intellectual project. In planning this webinar, the four of us realized that our own publishing background really played into our perceptions of open peer review and ways in which we either connected to or struggled with that framework. So I want to share a little bit about me, specifically kind of my background with publishing. First of all, I'm Leah Duncan. I don't think I've said that yet. I'm the digital humanities librarian at Davidson College, and I'm the editor of JCDL. I came to librarianship initially through a digital humanities graduate assistantship I was working on while pursuing my PhD in English at LSU, Louisiana State University. And after finishing my PhD, I was able to work in the library at LSU, and I earned my MLIS during that time. So reflecting on my own frameworks, this experience has introduced two competing value sets in my head. So as a librarian, I learned to value community and dialogue over siloed individual intellectual output, which was more prioritized while I pursued a PhD in English. But then as someone who has attempted to publish as the sole author in literary journals, I learned an expectation that academic publishing just has to be brutal. If it's going to be rigorous, it's going to be hard, it's going to be probably unkind. Essentially, if you aren't crying, you're probably doing something wrong. So in working with JCDL, I've had to deconstruct some of these assumptions that lead me, if I'm not careful, to conflate excellent scholarship or rigor with academic language, formality, and sort of detachment from the human behind the ideas. And I've had to think about the difference between constructive peer review in open dialogue and the blind review that I am more used to, which addresses ideas and deprioritizes the people that wrote them. So that's a little bit of my origin story. I want to tell you a little about how JCDL was born. Around 2019, 2020, Sophie and I were colleagues at Louisiana State University in the libraries, and we were managing, developing, promoting the Louisiana Digital Library, which is a multi-institutional state library. We had received a Mellon grant that funded several projects related to developing ethical collections as data. And our particular project, our one project within a cohort of projects, involved gathering LDL administrators from across the state to talk about our collection development practices, our metadata guidelines, etc. One way in which we facilitated these big conversations was by hosting a speaker series where we brought in several, virtually, it was 2020 and 2021, but we brought in several scholar librarians, Dorothy Berry, Tanya Sutherland, Jacqueline Wernema, and then others, to talk about collections as data as related to the Louisiana Digital Library. So as a result of this speaker series, a group of brilliant people had developed original research specifically about digital libraries, and we wanted to be able to share it more broadly, but we didn't feel we had the ideal venue for that work. So we created the venue. Sophie was kind of conducting the train at that point, and we founded JCDL. While we were founding it, we talked to folks at Code for Lib, in the Library with the Lead Pipe, both of which are other library journals that have an open peer review process. We were really inspired by them, guided by their experience. And Code for Lib puts it really well. They have on their website, Code for Lib seeks to lower the barriers to professional communication, stating the rigid structure and style enforced by traditional refereed scholarly journals is one such barrier preventing busy library workers from contributing because of the added commitment this entails. And we really share in that sort of ethos. So the first issue we published was a special issue of papers developed from that grant-funded speaker series. Our original peer review workflow has changed over the years. So the peer review workflow of our first 3 issues used Google Docs and Zoom meetings for collaboration. Reviewers were free to leave comments on the Google Docs, organize their notes for authors in whatever way worked for them, and then authors and reviewers would meet if they wanted to via Zoom to discuss the feedback. While this system fostered open dialogue, it was really fruitful. We found that sometimes the peer review process was protracted for papers that would ultimately not be published. The organic dialogue between reviewers and authors sometimes didn't create a clear space for a reviewer or author to kind of step back and assess progress. So another issue is that the Google Doc system also sometimes tempted reviewers to make copy editing suggestions too early in the process. So, I mean, who among us can see a typo in a Google Doc and not suggest it be fixed? But those granular edits were sometimes distracting from the larger ideas that were more appropriate for that, like an earlier point in peer review. Last year, we migrated from bpress to open journal systems, and we're now published by Litwin instead of LSU or any specific university. And we took this migration as a time to revise our peer review process by adding structure. So reviewers now use a feedback form to answer high-level questions about manuscripts, and there are 2 rounds of peer review before authors submit for final editorial decision. We've only been able to test this process once so far, to be transparent, but I do feel confident that it'll lead to a more efficient experience for authors and reviewers. Although we've addressed some challenges, we can go to the next slide. There are more challenges we're still thinking through. So first is this issue of emotional risk that I've been thinking about. I've observed, mostly anecdotally, that the tone of conflict between authors and reviewers is a little different than it is in blind peer review. Or maybe it's that when there is conflict, there's actually somewhere for it to go, someone for it to be directed towards, right? So with blind peer review, an author might be very frustrated. I've been frustrated by a review, but you're pretty much left to sit in the dark with that frustration. In open peer review, you can talk about it. That can lead to really strong collegial connections, honest conversation, productive progress. But it can also lead to tense feelings that are uncomfortable in a way that is kind of particular to knowing who you are in disagreement with. I think the risk is worth it, and our other panelists are going to talk more about that, but there is that risk. Also, since we're open to various formats and levels of formality, we have to continually think through what our expectations and criteria are for published work. The lack of rigidity can create more work for editors and reviewers in thinking through the value of a contribution outside of those traditional signals of like scholarship. So we want to ensure rigorous critical thought while also like Code for Lib writes lowering the barriers to professional communication. And then finally, logistically, we currently don't have enough submissions. We have a lot of interested and highly qualified reviewers. So looking toward the future, and that's the next slide, we have to take steps to actively promote the journal more than we're doing now. We need to strategize around this. We might consider a model of publishing topic-based special issues, recruiting based on those topics, but that's a conversation to be had. Given the flexibility of our expectations and the emotional risk of open peer review, we've also discussed providing more guidance to reviewers than a reviewer might receive from a more traditional journal. Guidance like talking about effective communication with authors, making sure reviewers are confident talking about our scope, our values, that sort of thing. We would also like to create more of a space to build community among our reviewers and authors. People aren't super excited about another Slack channel or Discord, but we've talked about a kind of a quarterly meeting to share projects, connect, maybe virtually. And we need to think about our review workflow for creative work. So our current feedback forms are more relevant to text-based work like articles, papers, that sort of thing, than it might be for a fiction piece or even a podcast. So that's something I look forward to thinking through more and working out. And I hope we're forced to work it out because we're going to get so many creative submissions in the future. So that's kind of an overview of JCDL from the editorial perspective, and I am passing it off to Janine.
Thank you, Leah. Is Janine Finn. I'm the head of data and digital scholarship services at the Claremont College's library, which is in Southern California, where it's a beautiful day. And I'm home alone with a dog right now, and she's staring at me like, why are we inside? So I'm trying to keep her distracted. I'm really glad to be here. A little bit about my background to sort of understand some of my perspective and my positionality here. I came from the University of Illinois. I had a bachelor's degree in liberal arts and jumped right into an MLS degree to pay back my student loans. And then it's just sort of been library stuff from then on out. I was a library clerk. I was a librarian in academic libraries. I wound up pursuing a PhD in information science at the University of Texas after a stint working for the Texas legislature, which is a whole other discussion. But I was really curious about issues of trust and communication and how we build online communities. And a clear postdoctoral program brought me to the Claremont College's library, where I have oversight over different kinds of data services, but also digital scholarship, digital exhibits that we put together with our colleagues in special collections. I also do some instructing. I'm adjunct faculty at a couple of our institutions here at Claremont. And I bring that up just because I think I bring that sort of teaching perspective sometimes to this review process. And sometimes that's good. And sometimes it's really inappropriate. And that's an ongoing challenge for me. So I'll talk a little bit about that. We can go to next slide. Like Leah, I came out of a PhD program that had sort of a very traditional approach to academic writing and academic publishing. It was uncomfortable for me, as I think it is for a lot of us who go through that process, particularly as people, working in libraries. Academic writing can be stressful and isolating. And as library people, we're often just sort of pulling little scraps of time out of our day-to-day work or weekends to get that writing work done. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. I'm in my work, I'm pretty focused on constructs of labor too. I'm third generation union organizer, so I'm very conscious of expectations. What do we expect from each other, from our colleagues, from our supervisors in libraries. And academic writing often just sort of like slides in under the radar of all those things. The profit structures and labor, as we've talked about in traditional academic publishing, isn't a good fit for a lot of us. It isn't very fair. And if we want, like this is it, right? This is praxis. If we want a more humane profession doing this kind of work in an open journal, in an open peer review journal, I think is important. It's not perfect. It brings alongside other challenges and other things we need to constantly resolve. But I think this is an important step forward. It's also a great way for me to learn. There are a number of reviewers on the journal, and we all have some areas of specialty and expertise, but we're always learning from each other, and that's been enjoyable in a way that blind peer review in like an Elsevier journal is not fun at all. Next slide, please. Thanks, Kay. This is my little tree slide. This is what has sort of kept me going in this academic publishing space is this notion of an ethic of care, which is a concept. If you want to do a lit review, Joan Tronto conceived of this concept in the early 90s, talking about social work and nursing work. And it sort of foregrounds, it's based on some feminist scholarship as well, centering the idea that caring for each other is meaningful work that deserves to be centered in the same way original research is centered and management skills are centered. Caring for each other is a central and important part of the work we do as a community. And to me, the engagement and practices that we do in an open peer review or try to do or continue to improve is an important part of that growth and keeping that ethic of care alive. Next slide, please. So the highlights of the open peer review process for me as a reviewer, I think are very similar to what Leah has brought up as an editor. The collaboration, it is synchronous, it is asynchronous, it sort of, sneaks around. The Google Docs can be great. The Google Docs can also invite, as Leah mentioned, a lot of sort of nitty-gritty conversation that isn't really appropriate. It's a chance to have broad conversations on a topic and maybe a topic that you're not particularly familiar with. It's something we often don't get to do as practitioners. We get to sort of, think deep and think critically about issues as part of our work. And I really appreciate, particularly as a teacher, as an instructor, the focus on process, not product. We are learning collaboratively and communally in this process, and that is not always something that is appreciated or centered in the workplace environment. Next slide, please. The challenges. I think a lot of this, again, reflects what Leah has said, and will probably speak to what Ben and Kay bring up as well. The process can feel squishy, and this is, I'm speaking to the earlier editorial review process. I haven't had a chance to participate in this new process, and I'm looking forward to it. But in the earlier process, it felt like the timeline was a little squishy, and I think that was frustrating for the contributors as well. Like, what is the timeline? When is done? Where are the expectations for making progress and making some editorial changes? And again, the teaching role as a reviewer. I'm not a teacher here, and that's a hierarchical thing that isn't appropriate always in these situations. So I try to dial that back and be conscious of that all the time. Sometimes I do good and sometimes I mess it up. And reviewers are not editorial decision makers. We are alongside the contributors trying to make the work better, trying to support them and develop the work, but we're not the editorial decision makers. We don't ultimately say yes or no, this is going in a journal, and that can sometimes be a little bit awkward. Next slide. Oh, okay. I'm into my reading section. In preparing this presentation, I sort of wanted to back up a little bit and think about how I would explain this to folks who are maybe new to this concept. These are a couple pieces of reading that I have found particularly helpful to sort of ground myself and think about open peer review. The first one is from our wonderful friends in the library with the lead pipe, using open peer review as information literacy instruction. I don't do information literacy instruction in my daily life right now, but I think we're all familiar with it. And I think conceptually, that's a really helpful framework to sort of think about what kind of role open peer review can play in a library environment. And I really like this recent article from the Journal of Electronic Publishing. It speaks to affordances of scholarly podcasting, which is something that I am new to. Our presenter Kay is not, and they will have much to say about that. But I really appreciated that perspective of podcasting as a mode for conversation and sort of embodying research and conversation in a different modality. So that's all I have. Thank you. I'm very happy to pass this along to my colleague, Ben Chupasa.
Awesome, awesome. Thanks, Janine. And hello, everyone. I'm Ben Chupasa, he, him, his. I'm the Social Sciences and Policy Librarian over at Columbia University Libraries. I'm based out of New York City. Probably different weather than what you're dealing with right now, Janine. Very windy here right now. It definitely feels like fall. And yeah, right here in my position, I've been in this position for a little over 3 years now. And I'm here today to talk a little bit more about my experiences, my reflections on being in the open peer review process with JCDL as an author. So from the perspective of an author who published back during the 2021-2022 period. And I do wanted to start off by giving some context, background, where I situated it and where my headspace was at before publishing with JCDL. So for that context, I had only published for closed peer review publication outlets. And really one of the catalysts or the impetus for even getting into participating in publishing, intellectual output, can be really traced back to one of my first librarian gigs, where I was in a tenure track role at University of Montana. I've since moved on to a position where I am right now that isn't related to being in a tenure track role. I'm not a tenure track faculty member, but publishing is still recognized in my role as something that can help with matters related to promotion and rank and so forth. So basically, I was in a position where I was just aware that a peer review process exists, right? I saw peer review as something that happens on the back end where me as an author, I would submit something, I would get feedback, I'd fix said things based on feedback, resubmit, and continue on with the cycle. So on a similar vein, I didn't really think much about the pros and cons of open versus closed review. I came from a mindset of I have this project, I want to get it published, I want to disseminate it to the general public. Peer review is a check and balance system that I have to navigate around. So it was the sense that I get why it exists, but it is also something that is very stressful, right? And I think that stems from just human nature of the fear of rejection, right? It's never a guarantee when you go through that process that it will end up getting disseminated. So only having been an author too, by the time I entered the foray into JCDL. So I had never been a peer reviewer for an academic journal before. And when it came into this space, I thought that the idea of open peer review seemed very promising. I was admittedly unsure what the exact steps would be under this context. And I wanted to preface also by saying that when I was an author during that 2021-2022 period, there had not been at the time some of the new structures or systems that Liam had mentioned earlier during this presentation. So coming in, I knew that it was open peer review, but I wasn't really given that much information regarding what to expect. So and yeah, and on that vein, Leah recently talked about this revised workflow, right? With more systems in place, more communication, and that commitment to expectations. So it's really part of that free flowy stage, if you will, of JCDL's humble beginnings. So, and thanks for that. Okay, so this slide right here is just highlighting, showcasing the article I worked on. In a nutshell, the article proposes that librarians can advance critical data literacy pedagogy by uniting diverse expertise. So whether that's coming from the infolit space, instruction, data services, technical services, all have kind of conflicting or similar frameworks coming together through communities of practice to really build competencies related to critical lens on data literacy can be a fruitful experience. So check out the article if you're inclined. Next, please. But yeah, so that article, right, went through the open peer review process. What I have on this slide right now is that traditional closed peer review process. So wanted to emphasize what Janine said earlier, right, that reviewers are not editorial decision makers in both, right, open and closed. But what's maybe different here compared to if we were to look at open is that there does seem to be here many pit stops that has the editor being almost like a siphon, if you will. And next slide, please. And this is one of the maybe many things that kind of pose hidden challenges for authors. And I kind of wanted to talk about them right now and reflecting on my time in closed review. So one of the things is that it's sometimes difficult to distinguish between major substantive feedback and minor suggestions. As authors, when we're juggling multiple comments, multiple feedback points, it's hard to tell what would be a make it or break it point. When comments become incredibly jargony or on the flip side, very brief, right, it can become difficult to ascertain what a peer reviewer constitutes as something that really needs to get fixed, if how urgent it is. But sometimes we as an author there's not really kind of a a hierarchy, if you will, that's present to us. So this then creates a potential for miscommunication. So, and a game of telephone can result from that siphon involving the editor. So, and when we do, as authors, want clarification, we then have to deal with a potentially clunky channel for clarification, which leads to the point where if we need clarity on something, the system isn't necessarily set up so that there's a streamlined or straightforward way to get answers to your questions. So, and sometimes we're just again, tying back to human nature, we're just fearful of reaching out to ask these questions for fear of not wanting to garner too much attention during the phase of peer review and the editorial phase. All underlined by this assumption of power imbalance at play. So, in other words, so that anxiety of, ooh, the reviewer may not have the author's best interests at heart. So if I, the author, were to ask too many questions, I am accidentally making it seem like this piece is not worthy of publication. So because of that, I'd rather stay under the radar. Which kind of defeats the purpose, right, of actually engaging with the process to actually make the manuscript as best as it can be. So, so really tying back to that idea of a fear of speaking out, a fear of making a scene, a fear of retribution. So, next, please. So, yeah, so talking a little bit more now about that open peer review process in contracts, right? So shifting towards a more communicative relationship. Authors in this space get a better sense of where the reviewers are coming from and vice versa. So having those open conversations to gain clarity on that feedback and points, right? So again, not needing to like overthink, ooh, that comment carries a lot of weight. You get in that conversation and you realize, oh, it actually doesn't, or oh, it actually does. So so that is a good space to gain that clarity. Recognizing too that with any manuscript, article, piece of work, many concepts have complex dependencies. So when you end up changing one part of a project, one section of an article, that can adversely impact the clarity of another section, right? A chain reaction, if you will. You change up one part, you need to really update another. And without explaining that, right, to maybe a peer reviewer, so forth, it could prove to be counterproductive, and end up being further away from, right, making it the best possible final product that it can be. So again, that actual conversation being an effective way to navigate around these dependencies, have the opportunity to explain these dependencies, and ultimately save time at the end of the day, right? Avoiding that unnecessary back and forth whenever possible, and preventing further confusion. And yeah, I think too, that open peer review process makes for just generally a more pleasant and human experience. Leanne mentioned earlier that, the risk, if you will, of open peer review is that it could lead to potentially tense feelings that might have been avoided, right? If you didn't know who you were in disagreement with, that idea of tone conflict. I would argue that, if we think of that as being the worst case scenario, I still think there's a lot of value in just even having that conversation, because then as an author, you get a better sense of the why, you get a better sense of where the tense disagreement is coming from. Instead of just being presented with a wall of feedback text, a wall of commentary with no added context, that could be very scary to kind of confront without putting that face right behind that wall, if you will. So, but yeah, so that's my experience and my reflections related to being an author with JCDL. I want to now hand my baton over to Kay Baracracha, who is a colleague of mine
Yeah.
at Columbia.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, absolutely. I am the social work and professional studies librarian, also at Columbia University Libraries. Ben and I are about a block and a half from each other right now in our respective offices. And I'm going to talk a little bit about creating an audio project in an open peer-reviewed journal. So to give you a little sense of my professional and creative background, I'm a librarian, an academic librarian. I've been at Columbia since late 2018, and before that, I was a public librarian at Queens Public Library, and I'm also an oral historian. I have a master's degree in oral history from Columbia. I think of myself as like a scholarly artist or an artsy scholar. I've never been in a peer review process myself before, because like Ben, I'm not in a tenure track position. I'm not required to publish in that way. Which is kind of nice because it means that I am able to do something more creative when that's what I prefer to do. And I tend to work in a really process-oriented way, which I think was really great for it meant that the open peer review process worked really great for me, because I wasn't entirely sure what my final piece was going to be when I started, and the peer review process really helped. So what did I do? My piece is called Speculative Telephone, Oral Historians and Digital Librarians on how Libraries Could Be. And what I did for this was I conducted 6 interviews, 3 with oral historians and then 3 with digital librarians. And basically, the point was to ask information workers and memory workers to really like dream and speculate about their ideal worlds, and their ideal libraries and ideal library workflows in conversation with each other. And the final product ended up being 11 edited audio tracks. I mean, you can see on the right side of this slide some themes that came out of those interviews. So the themes are kind of all over the place because I had 6 conversations, and a lot of different things came out. So here is sort of it doesn't look streamlined, but this is the streamlined version of the production process. So I originally submitted this piece as just a proposal because it was part of a special issue, turning it on, turning it back off again, which asked for speculative work. So I submitted a proposal. That proposal was accepted pending peer review. And then I started interviewing oral historians, like 3 oral historians, about their dreams for libraries, for research, for their work. Then my peer reviewers listened to the full interview tracks, which was a big undertaking, and gave me feedback about the content and the themes and what they thought was interesting. Then I edited each oral historian interview, so each of those 3 interviews, down to 10 minutes. And my peer reviewers, and actually I was looking back, it wasn't just my peer reviewers, it's all my editors, Leah and Sophie, who were the editors on this issue, helped me to identify digital librarians to interview, which was very helpful, and I think could not have happened in a closed peer review process. It just wouldn't have happened. And so once I had those, I paired each oral historian interview with a librarian, and asked the librarian to react to what they heard, and recorded their speculation about how what the oral historian said they would like could really happen in a library. So then I edited all 6 interviews into 3 chapters. So it's kind of a playlist. I'll show you a screenshot. I recorded some like intro and outro audio. That's just me talking. My peer reviewers provided feedback on the final edit and the visual presentation of the audio files. And now the published article, it's not really an article, but the published piece is online, and it's those 11 tracks. And these are the credits for this piece. And I think just seeing how many people are involved shows you how complicated it was. And I wanted to show this because I felt like if this were a closed peer review process, this piece never would have happened because it was so complex and there were so many moving parts. I don't think I would have had the fortitude to do all this and then submit it and receive feedback. Part of that is because of the production and distribution challenges associated with audio, and especially audio in an academic journal context. So one thing that's difficult is it's hard to know. It was hard to know the direction of the project from the beginning because I hadn't done the interviews yet. And because this was like a highly interpersonal process all the way through. So it would have been hard to, if there had been an interview that I had completed and then didn't like, it would have been hard to cut it out. Luckily, I wasn't in that situation, but that was a tough thing that I was dealing with. It's also hard because you can't control an interview as it's happening. So you can't really outline and revise in the same way you could with a written piece. And then finally, audio quality is hard to fix in post. You can't really clean up a audio piece the same way you can like copy edit a written piece. And then just to give you a sense of how this looks, so this is how the piece looks in Spotify. And I'll put a link in the chat to how it looks in the journal. So in Spotify, you can see that I was able to like use some graphic design to indicate which tracks went with which chapters. But that was kind of hard to convey both in a like traditional podcast player and on the journal. But I think dealing with all of these complexities is worth it to have audio in an academic journal setting, because you do get a more conversational tone. And I think it opens up opportunities for people contributing. So the people who did the interviews and also people listening, so the potential audience, to engage in a way that otherwise they might not have time or energy to do. Because you might be able to, pop your headphones on and listen to this as you're going to lunch. And it might be like a lighter lift than reading a journal article. And also same thing with the interviewers or the interviewees. I don't know that they would have even been interested, especially the oral historians, I don't know that it would have occurred to them to participate in this. But because all they had to do was have a conversation, it was a lower lift. Yeah, and I also like how these interviews sort of allow the listener to see how the collaborators involved are thinking in real time. I think that is a value that we get from audio and from interviews that you don't always get from text. Okay, so we're gonna just spend about 3 minutes listening to some audio from my piece. This is from chapter 2, which is called Research Doula. And I've got 2 excerpts from my conversation with my friend Tamara Santibanez, who is a multimedia artist and oral historian. So this is one of the oral historian interviews. And what you're about to hear is us discussing the experience of going into a library or an archive for the first time. And approaching the collections and not really knowing what you're going to find or how to find it. So I'm going to try to change my share so that you can hear my audio. Let's see if it works. Okay.
I think I just struggle with, I think I get easily overwhelmed with digital access, and with sheer volume. So the person-to-person aspect is very supportive for me. If I know that I can email somebody or call somebody or walk in somewhere and just ask a person and say, hey, this is my question, or this is what I need help with. Can you help me? And usually that's with pretty positive results. But I think what I also worry about there is that I'm missing some sort of crucial part of the experience, right? Like when I think about my home library, actually my own personal library, I'm familiar with the connections that exist there. And so there's, I often find myself reading something, stopping, finding another book that relates to the thing that I was reading that I want to have on hand as I take in this new information. And there's all these connections and sort of a web that can be woven between what's there. And so with a library that is new to me, I fear that I lose out on that process. And I think maybe that's what I wonder, or what I feel shortchanged about, is what would that process look like? That exploratory process.
So that was the first clip. And we continue talking for a while. If you listen to the full piece, you can hear a little more context. But Tamara continues, and they come to sort of sum up what they think would be most helpful to them as a library patron for their work.
Yeah, I think just talking to a person. I think maybe like having some sort of readily accessible like research doula in the library. If I was able to show up and be like, this is my idea, this is what I'm curious about, where should I start, where can I go from there? I think that's something that I would really love.
So that's the end of Tamara's section, and the piece goes on to change over to a librarian responding to that, which I think is really, really fun, and I hope you'll go on to listen. So that's the end of our prepared presentation. I think we can take questions now.
I wonder, while people are thinking of their questions, I wonder if I could jump in with a question of my own. I didn't say this during the introductory remarks, but I do have a history with this journal. Leah, you and I being the original co-founders, as you mentioned. I wonder, Leah, when we were first talking about this, we knew this was kind of a wacky idea and that it could backfire in any number of ways. One of which is that we would just alienate ourselves and everybody would hate us, right? Because we would, they're the ones who know we're making the decisions about their articles. But one of the other things that I feel like we talked a lot about was the sustainability of the journal just in terms of whether or not this field was big enough. So again, we were interested in critical approaches to digital librarianship, and we were defining digital librarianship more or less the way that a lot of us in special collections define it. So what some other people might call digital archives. So it's not digital libraries in the sense of licensed material that you might say find in a public library, or even the non-special collections of academic libraries, but more sort of unique items that are, so selection is a big thing about that. Description is a big topic that comes up a lot. And I'm just sort of curious about your thoughts, if any, about the continued field, and whether or not you feel like the field has changed any over the last 4 or 5 years, whether or not the same topics that were important to us in 2021 are still happening now, or if you're seeing new things evolve. Anything that you have to say about that, I'm just very curious. Thank you.
That's a great question. I feel like it's an open question for me. Like I said, we aren't having submissions pouring in. That being said, I think we can do a lot more to promote our journal, let people know that we're here and what we do. In the past, we've had submissions where you do have to think, okay, this is a digital humanities project that is critical and it's interesting, but it's not really engaging with libraries as a central topic. So as much as I might like this idea as a digital humanities librarian, trying to stay within the scope of work that engages with digital libraries and digitized cultural heritage collections specifically. I also wonder if a lot of us, including myself, doing this kind of work are staff or not tenure track, and so research isn't as much of a requirement. I think that's a benefit of our structure of being open to case studies, reflections, dialogues, other types of work. For people who want to engage, who want to share what they're up to, but maybe don't have those kind of tenure academic requirements. I'm wondering, I think, so our original sort of list of topics that we would publish on, I remember, selection for digitization, metadata remediation, collections as data. I'm hearing a lot more about AI's impact on those topics right now, and I'm wondering if we're in a transition point where people's workflows are changing, or they're thinking about what labor is going to look like in the next couple of years, but we haven't got far enough to really write kind of complete ideas about it yet. So that's something I'm kind of wondering if there is a transition happening and we're in a point of waiting to see what that's going to look like. I see a question from Rachel. Rachel said, what are your thoughts on opening the reviews themselves to readers? Meaning, for example, in the JCDL special issue, where Kay's work appears, another piece incorporated and made visible the back and forth conversation between reviewers, editors, and authors. But open peer review often stops at reviewer-author identity and doesn't open up the content of the review dialogue itself. I like that idea. With the consent of all who participated.
Yeah, and I think the article itself is very cool. I just posted a link to the full issue, but I'm going to try to find the actual individual article.
It's a pretty touchy topic in STEM fields, I know, for like biomedical research, the open peer review and publishing those open peer reviews. Those have a lot more arguments about sort of like academic reputation and status and the money involved in some of these things. And I don't think we're in that place necessarily as librarians, but I would welcome talking about that kind of thing. I think it could benefit folks a lot, as we we talk about transparency, and especially things like sort of the slowness of the submissions happening right now and the pivot point you mentioned with AI. I think a lot of us feel sort of stuck a little bit waiting to see what happens next. And it's also a really small community. Like, we kind of know everybody. And I just got this email in from Reclaim Hosting. They're doing a thing about Omeka. It's like, oh, I know them and I know those other people. And we worked on this thing together. I mean, I feel like we're almost publishing our review. Like, we're so close to sort of being in an open, a little bit more open conversation. I think that could be interesting.
I'm curious, Ben, as an author, if you had known that that was an option that it was mine and Janine's notes to you about your article might be part of the published product. Would that have changed your viewpoint on it, your perspective?
I've been reflecting on that a bit, and I'm unsure because I feel as though at being prompted that question right now, I'm like, oh, it's out, sure. Go, because it's out in the world. We've kind of made our mark already, and it would be kind of nice to kind of get more nuance from getting from A to B, B to C. But in the thick of it, I wonder, like, ooh, is that something that felt like some points felt more tangential, which eventually led to a major change, but would there be, I guess there wouldn't be much harm in that being out. If anything, it's prompting me to maybe say I know this is a little much, but authors commentary on the open back and forth conversations, which is so meta because there's another layer there that we have to deal with as well. But I admittedly maybe worry about the missing context, but I'm not necessarily, antagonistic towards it as well. So yeah.
Something to think about, future special issue. All right, I think it is right at 2 p.m. So I think that'll be the end of our Q&A session. Thank you, Sophie, for hosting us.
Thanks y'all for doing this. This was amazing. It's so good to hear about the journal. We'll have this recording sent out when it's available on YouTube. We'll send the link out to everybody who registered and, of course, all of our panelists. And I encourage everyone who made it here today to think about how you can interact with the journal. So usually a wonderful way to get started in publishing if you haven't done that yet, or a way to just sort of see a whole different way of doing it, which of course was the whole point. Thank you all again. Hope you have a beautiful day.